Shalom. I am Elise Chamebrown, the Director of Holocaust Education for the Jewish Federation of Greater Metro West. Together with our partners at the Kean University's Holocaust Resource Center, I am happy to welcome all of you here today, and we thank you for joining us once again. Often in the world of Holocaust education, we question if the ever-popular term, never forget, is truly working. And although recent events in Ukraine have shocked and saddened us, we have also witnessed the great effects of strong Holocaust education and a focus on never forget taking place around the world as we are seeing war rage once more in Europe. In recent weeks, I have read article upon article expressing the kindness of strangers and what they have been doing to aid those in need in Ukraine. One that struck me greatly was titled, "Holocaust Survivors Flee from Ukraine to Germany for Safety." What an incredible twist of fate. Several thousand Holocaust survivors from Ukraine have sought safety and refuge in Germany. Those that were once children under the ravages of the Second World War are once again now in the later years of their lives facing atrocities. But this time, those same victims that went through the unimaginable as the Nazis tore at the very core of their lives are now finding a chance to survive in the heart of what was once the Nazi regime. At times it is unfathomable to think that this is taking place once more, and our hearts are torn when we hear the news of these survivors and countless others suffering again. But we also marvel at the changes we have seen in Germany, other European nations, and across the world at large, as we have come together to do what we can to help, providing aid that was almost impossible to find during the Holocaust. On the eve of Yom HaShoah, we joined together to remember and to commemorate the 6 million Jews and 6 million others that perished at the hands of the Nazis. We also joined together to honor all those that survived, to ensure that never forget could become a reality. I am so deeply saddened that the Holocaust survivors around the world have had to witness destruction and war once again, yet also so incredibly grateful that they have lived to see their message carry forth to the next generation. It is truly a blessing that after 2 years completely apart, that we are able to have Holocaust survivors with us today to light candles in memory of all those that perished, along with hearing from Rabbi Aaron Glazer and Cantor Perry Fine. Rabbi Glazer will now share a few remarks.
I'm Rabbi Aaron Glazer from Temple Sinai in Summit. As we commemorate Yom HaShoah this year, it is impossible to do so without calling to mind all that is happening in the world around us. The images of refugees from Ukraine streaming across the borders of Europe with no more than a bag or a suitcase in their hands. Pictures of women and children forced to leave their homes because of war, separated from their families, desperate, unsure of the future. These stories remind us of our own people's history. On Yom HaShoah, we call out the evil of the Nazis, and we urge the world not to forget the terror, displacement, and devastation of the Holocaust, the consequences of hatred and bigotry, and the dangers of authoritarian leadership. We remember the millions of individual souls who were murdered. We say their names, we light their candles, we hold on to memories, and we carry them in our hearts. We remember and honor those who survived, the ones who can tell the story of both horror and hope, of what it takes to keep living. And we remember the rescuers, those who risked their own lives to do what was right and just. On Yom HaShoah, we remember them all. As Elie Wiesel taught in his 1986 Nobel Peace Prize lecture, it is memory that will save humanity. He continued, "Let us remember Job, who, having lost everything, his children, his friends, his possessions, and even his argument with God, still found the strength to begin again, to rebuild his life. Job was determined not to repudiate the creation, however imperfect, that God had entrusted to him. Wiesel says, Job, our ancestor, Job, our contemporary, his ordeal concerns all humanity. Did he ever lose his faith? If so, he rediscovered it within his rebellion. He demonstrated that faith is essential to rebellion and that hope is possible beyond despair. The source of his hope was memory, as it must be ours. We remember our own people's story, and those memories compel us to actively engage in the story of all humanity. Together, good people of conscience can make a difference now as in the past. Together, we can ensure that hope is possible beyond despair. The source of our hope is memory, and so on Yom HaShoah, we remember. It is my honor to welcome the survivors from our community who will remember by participating in our candle lighting ritual.
Edith Farbman. Geeta Mann. Hannah Wexler. Professor Susan Letterman. Janice Coven. Fred Heyman.
Want to say something, okay? I light this candle on behalf of all the people that were murdered by Adolf Hitler. I was born in Berlin and survived the Holocaust in Berlin. In lighting this candle, I have a silent prayer for all the wonderful people and citizens in the Ukraine that are going through what I went through. Okay? Thank you.
Professor Peter Angler. Saul Spearer. Thank you all so much for being here and joining with us today to light these candles. It is now my honor to introduce Cantor Perry Fine.
Elie Wiesel, Nobel laureate, witness, voice of conscience. When speaking of the Shoah, would often recall a tune he learned as a youth growing up in the shtetl, a haunting melody which he himself used to sing, a song of faith, be'emunah shlema, in the coming of the Mashiach, of the Messiah, and the hope of a better world. Ani ma'amin be'emunah shlema, I believe with complete faith in the coming of the Messiah. And though he may tarry, nonetheless, I wait daily for his coming. Ani ma'amin be'emunah shlema B'vias HaMashiach. Ani ma'amin be'emunah shlema b'vias HaMashiach. Ani ma'amin be'emunah shlema b'vias HaMashiach. Ve'afal pi shayit mameya achake lo b'chol yom shavot. Ve'afal pi shayit mameya achake lo b'chol yom sheyavot. Ani ma'amin be'emunah shlema b'vias HaMashiach. Ani ma'amin be'emunah shlema b'vias HaMashiach.
Mourners Kaddish for this Yom HaShoah. Yitgadal,
Auschwitz,
V'yitkadash,
Lodz,
Shemei Rabbah,
Ponar,
Be'alma Divra Chirute,
Babi Yar,
V'yamlich Malchute,
Madanik,
V'chayechon Uv'yomechon,
Birkenau,
Uv'chayedechol Beit Yisrael,
Kovno,
Ba'agala Uvizman Kariv,
Yanovska,
V'imru Amen. Yehei Shmei Rabbah Mevarach, Le'alam Omei Almaya, Yitbarach V'yishtabach,
Theresienstadt,
V'yitpa'ar V'yitromam,
Buchenwald,
V'yitnaseh V'yitadar,
Treblinka,
V'yitaleh V'yitalal,
Vilna,
Shemei de Kudusha B'richu,
Bergen-Belsen,
Le'elah,
Mauthausen,
Min Kol Birchata V'shirata,
Dachau,
Tushbechata V'nechemata,
Minsk,
Da'amiran Be'alma,
Warsaw,
V'imru Amen. Yehei Shlama Rabba Min Shemaya, V'chayim Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael, V'imru Amen. Oseh Shalom B'mromav, Hu Ya'aseh Shalom, Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael, V'imru Amen.
Shalom. My name is Adara Goldberg, and I am the director of the Holocaust Resource Center of Kane University. It is a distinct honor to commemorate Yom HaShoah with all of you, with our partners here at Federation, but most importantly, the members of our Holocaust survivor community. 2 years ago, if I could imagine this moment and that we would all be together again, I don't know if it would have been seen. And witnessing our survivors here today, lighting candles in person as a community, is something I will never forget. As a historian and educator, I'm often asked why we do the things that we do. And I think it's important that we understand the history behind Yom HaShoah. In 1959, Israel's parliament established the Martyrs and Heroes Remembrance Day law. This law, known today as Yom HaShoah, formalized the annual commemorations that were already happening for the Shoah. This became a day to remember the terror wrought by the Nazis and their collaborators against our people, and to honor the heroic efforts of European Jewry who sought to fight back against their tormentors through acts of resistance, despite the overwhelming odds against them. The law paid tribute to those whose lives were dramatically cut short because they had committed the ultimate crime of being Jewish, while honoring those survivors who bravely rebuilt their lives in new lands around the world. 69 years after the establishment of Yom HaShoah, 63 years after the establishment of the Yom HaShoah law, and 79 years after the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the impetus for education and remembrance is more important than ever before. But our landscape has changed. Survivors, whose eyewitness accounts form the backbone of Holocaust education for decades, are declining in numbers rapidly. For so many years, these men and women courageously advocated for Holocaust mandates, formed resource centers, gave their testimonies, and organized our community commemorations. They are irreplaceable, and it is our collective obligation to responsibly and accurately transmit their narratives to future generations. We must carry the torch. Another challenge facing us today is the rise in anti-Semitism. Our students deserve to learn about the history of anti-Semitism, the history of the Holocaust, and what it means to us today. They deserve to know the meaning behind the hateful and frightening symbols that appear in their schools and parks. And it is our responsibility to teach them. And lastly, we are facing the social disease of Holocaust revisionism and denial. And it is more imperative than ever before that we continue to battle misinformation and ignorance with the truth, and to empower everyone in our communities with the knowledge and the confidence to necessarily combat anti-Semitism, bias, and hateful speech. These youth are our futures, and we are here to empower them and make the world a better place than it once was. I invite all of you joining us tonight to come together with us in this act of conscientious remembrance and education. Let us honor the legacy of those survivors who lit the candles tonight by actively listening to their stories, beginning with this evening's discussion that you will soon hear with Ma Dame and Egrin Stepek. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Adara Goldberg, and I'm the director of the Holocaust Resource Center here at Kean University. Thank you all for being here with us on this beautiful evening to commemorate Yom HaShoah. It is now my honor to introduce the Kean University president, Lamont Repollet, to offer greetings on behalf of the university.
Good evening. I am Dr. Lamont Repollet, president of Kean University. Tonight, I am privileged to be with all of you, members of the campus and Jewish communities, to commemorate Holocaust Remembrance Day, Yom HaShoah, which literally translates to the Day of Remembrance of the Catastrophe and Heroism. We remember all those who endured unimaginable horror, pain, and suffering at the hands of the Nazis and their collaborators across occupied Europe, and to memorialize the 6 million Jews, from babies to the elderly, who were systemically murdered during World War II in Germany, simply and solely because they were Jewish. We recognize the heroism of those who emerged from that dark, horrendous era in human history, and honor those who continue to tell their stories of loss, liberation, and bravery in the face of danger. Together, we have the good fortune of sharing time and virtual space this evening with Holocaust survivors and liberators and their descendants, and to hear their stories, 77 years after Europe's liberation from Nazi terror. As the memory of the Holocaust recedes further into history, this moment is a precious gift. As we reflect on a state-sponsored and man-made massacre fueled by evil and anti-Semitism that was the Holocaust, we must also acknowledge those in our communities who today continue to be harmed or worse by war, neo-Nazism, white supremacy, and hate. We cannot ignore the need for prioritizing purposeful action to ensure equity, justice, and peace, now more than ever. Just as survivors of the Holocaust never forgot their harrowing experiences, and their descendants continue to speak out on behalf of their deceased loved ones, we must never forget to share and lift up the voices of those so deeply impacted by the Holocaust long after Yom HaShoah ends tomorrow. We owe it to our ancestors and to all of our future generations. It's our moral obligation. I'm committed to doing what I can, personally and professionally, to act against oppression and exclusion and to challenge prejudice and hate in policies and practices. Here at Kean, we provide the lessons and support needed for our staff and students to do the same. I thank our speakers, the staff and supporters of the Holocaust Resource Center at Kean University, and all of you for being here, being present to speak up for justice and peace. We must denounce the atrocities of the past and honor all who were lost by standing up for social justice in our world today. Only together can we create a safer existence for each and every one of us. Be blessed. Shalom.
Good evening. I am David Saginaw, the president of the Jewish Federation of Greater Metro West New Jersey. And while for the third year in a row we are unable to be physically in person, we are very much together tonight in spirit as we continue with this important tradition. Thank you everyone for being here today to not only remember the 11 million lives that were lost during the Holocaust, but also to honor all the Holocaust survivors and saviors who have gone on to tell their stories, always striving to never forget the horrors of the past. Although none of my family perished in the Holocaust, Holocaust education and remembrance has always been an especially important priority for me personally, as well as for our Greater Metro West Federation. To learn about how a Jew was helped by others is one of the most important lessons we can take away from this dark time in history. We are honored tonight to be able to hear from both a survivor and a savior. At our federation, we are often inspired by life lessons, and what follows is one of those. I now have the pleasure of introducing Elise Shane Brown, the Director of Holocaust Education at the Jewish Federation of Greater Metro West, who will moderate this fascinating conversation. Elise.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, David, and thank you, President Repollet, for being here and joining us today in this beautiful commemoration and this important conversation. I'm so honored to be here tonight with Maud Dame, a Holocaust survivor from Holland, and with Ingrid Stepik, who is a family member of the family that saved Maud and her family. It is such a pleasure to be with you both today and welcome you here with us on the evening of Yom HaShoah. How are you both this evening?
Fine.
Great.
Very well, thank you.
Thank you. Can you both start, we can start with Maud and then go to Ingrid. Can you both share a little bit about your backgrounds, where you were born, where and when you were born, and a little bit of your family's history?
I was born in a town called Amersfoort in the Netherlands, and I lived there with my mother, my father, and I have a sister who's 2 years younger than I. We lived a very idyllic life. My Dutch grandfather had a restaurant at the train station where my dad was employed as the chef. And they also had like a newspaper stand at the train station in Amersfoort and other train stations throughout the Netherlands.
Okay, thank you. Ingrid?
Mm-hmm. I was also born in Amersfoort, but my family actually moved there just as the war started. In fact, they moved into that town the day before the Germans invaded the Netherlands. So at that point, they were not really strangers, but they didn't really know their neighbors. And so that played a role in how things developed after the Germans invaded the Netherlands. It took about 5 days to overrun the country. And my father and mother were always right from the beginning, very anti-German. At that time, they lived in Amersfoort, and I have 2 older sisters and a brother. I wasn't born yet. And so from that time on, we lived there in Amersfoort through the war and after the war.
Thank you. So when as you said, the Nazis invaded 1940, can you talk a little bit about, Maud, what happened with your family initially when the Nazis took over and came into Holland?
Well, of course, that whole, when the night they invaded, so much was going on. And of course, we discovered we were being invaded, even though the Netherlands had declared their neutrality. Hitler still invaded the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. And at first, at the very beginning, it was, everything seems to be as normal, but then very quickly things started to happen. The Queen left the country and set up government in exile. And a gentleman by the name of Dr. Arthur Seyss-Inquart now became the commandant of the Netherlands. And one of the very first things that was done was that everyone who was Jewish had to register. So who would have ever dreamt what this would lead up to? But people registered. They now had all of our names, addresses, etc. And slowly more and more restrictions started to come out. I was attending public school, kindergarten. I had to leave school. Jewish children cannot attend public school. Jewish teachers were fired. Anyone who worked for the government in capacity, federal government or the township or the city, if you were Jewish, you were fired. So many, many things started to happen in succession, just one after the other, taking away many of our rights, even though we were Dutch citizens too, like everyone else.
Right. And how old were you at this time? Can you just share that with us?
Well, I was 4 years old when we were invaded. And by the time I went into hiding, I was 6.5 years old.
So tell us a little bit about that, about going into hiding from both perspectives, Maud from yours, and Ingrid, if you can share with us what you know about how your family helped those that were going into hiding.
Well, of course, a letter was read from Dr. Size Imquart that everyone had to be at the train station on a certain day, a certain time, and a list of items you could bring with you. My parents, everybody was saying, well, it only said the trains are going east. This was on a Sunday afternoon at our synagogue when this announcement was made. My parents snuck into a house, a friend of theirs, Kees van Zwol, who was also, I think, the deputy mayor at the time, and they thought maybe he knows what's going on. We weren't allowed to associate with our Christian friends. And my parents, he said, no, don't go on the trains. He said, we have been working very hard. I am with the resistance, and we have an address for your children. I cannot tell you who they are, where they live, and I need to know by tomorrow morning.
Wow, that's incredible. Do you know how your parents knew to go to them, or how they knew, or it just was sort of, this was a friend of theirs and they put their trust in him to take care of you?
Well, they trusted him and they went home. And I think the only thing he said was that they lived on a farm, this family. And that's all. He said, I can't give you the names of the people who are willing to take your daughters. All he said was they lived on a farm.
That's remarkable. And you were 6 and your sister was 4.
Yes.
So Ingrid, from your perspective, because now into your family, can you share with us a little bit about how your family came into be in this story and how your family came to help Maud's?
Mm-hmm. As I said, my parents were anti-German to begin with, and they had a good idea of what was going on. What Maud said is right. You didn't know. You usually did not get in direct contact. It was through a friend or a friend of a friend. And my father was in a position where he could be very useful. He worked in the post office. We had just moved from a very small village, from a rural community to the town. And so the village where he came from, he and my mother, he knew everybody there. He knew all the farmers. There was no Jewish community there. It was a small, poor village, but he knew everyone because my grandmother was a midwife there. And so when they started talking about, well, what are we going to do with these Jewish citizens? Are they going to report? If they reported to the train station, they were gone. That was the end. And so he talked to people there, to farmers, to his family, he had lots of brothers and sisters. And so this person that Maud is referring to had, asked my dad, can you help? And so he said, yeah, he would find a place. And so again, it was never direct, but Maud and her sister were the first children that my parents rescued. Almost at the same time, there was another little Jewish boy. And then very soon, one after the other, there were adults and two other small children from Amersfoort, also about that same age. And my dad would find places in farms or, local. Maybe it was a local butcher, maybe it was his sister or his brother. And he he sort of put the squeeze on people. He was good at that. These
He must have
most
been a
of the
good
vill-
talker.
Well, yes, and he was also a little bit, he did okay
Mhm.
for himself. He was better educated than most people, so people admired him. He had moved away. He had a good job, and it was a very religious environment. But my parents were not religious, but he wasn't beyond using that. And people would say, I mean, I've heard him say, these are God's chosen people, so therefore we have to help them. And it's surprising how often people agreed to do just that. And as I said, they were almost all poor farmers. So that is how Maud and her sister, they didn't really stay with us. Some other people later did, 2 couples, but most of the 40 people that my parents helped were, just temporarily, they were just shunted onto, family members and other people, and they almost all survived.
Thank you. That.
As a matter of fact, I did spend one night at your house.
Mhm.
The day that my parents agreed, my father was told where to bring my sister and I. My mother packed a little suitcase because I was told by my parents we were going to a farm for a 2-week vacation. So when I remember arriving, we were riding our tricycles. My father had the little suitcases, and we got to the garden gate at your home. And my father said goodbye, gave me the suitcases, and he said, I'll see you in a couple of weeks. Have a good time on the farm. And we went in the house, and we didn't know your family, but everybody was so nice because they had your brothers and sisters were there, and they actually put us to bed at your house. And until about 2:00 in the morning when we were woken up because we had to leave.
So that's a perfect segue. Can you share with us now, they've made these arrangements, Ingrid's father has made these arrangements for us, and what happens as you and your sister, young children, go into hiding?
Well, we had to take a train, and we couldn't leave from our hometown because we were easily recognized because of the businesses around the train station. People knew us. Also, at this time, I had to wear a star because anyone who was 6 years old and older had to wear the yellow star. So it was decided, I guess, to have us leave from Nijkerk, I think it was. And the reason was that we had to get up in the middle of the night because we went with Ingrid's father, Jan Canis, had to walk through the woods during the night to go to the next town to catch a train there because nobody knew us there. And Ingrid and I have reminisced about that because her father was very upset with me because I had a flashlight walking through the woods and I discovered blueberries. So I'm picking blueberries. And I remember he said, okay, that's enough, stop, go. So, and I remember, I think your father shared that story with Ingrid later on. So, and we did indeed arrive on the farm. And as Ingrid said, it was, there were poor farmers and they very deeply religious and felt that this was what they want to do, knowing full well that if we were found there, they would be taken too. And this happened to be a couple who were in their 60s and had no children and just darling people. I mean, here you were 6.5 years old and you suddenly with total strangers thinking it's only going to be 2 weeks. It turned out to be 3 years.
Wow. And during those 3 years, you stayed in one place?
No, we evidently, a lot of things happened, a lot of things, as a child, some of the things I saw should no child experience. And the fear, because I knew at this age that what could happen to us. I had an assumed name that I had to learn, and I had to also watch over my sister, who was only 4.5 at the time. And one evening, uncle in 1944 had a heart attack and died because we had to call them aunt and uncle. We were their nieces. And with their last names, Sprunk, and different first names. And after he passed away, the resistance came to my aunt now and said, we have to find another address for these children because you cannot run the farm anymore. And she said, no, 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 I'm keeping them. And if their parents return, I will return them to their parents. If not, I will raise them as my own. So we stayed until right after Christmas in 1944, when strangers came in and said to my sister and I, get on the back of our bikes, you have to leave. Evidently, someone had revealed who we were and where we were. And it had been overheard. So the resistance had heard this and then they set their wheels into motion to immediately move us from the farmhouse. And then we ended up in a small, we had been in Olderbroek. Now we were sent to a little village, fishing village called Elber, where we stayed until the end of the war.
And as obviously from what you're saying and having to move, the danger to the people hiding you was really tremendous. Ingrid, can you speak a little bit about that and the danger to your own family? And when were you born that you came into all of this?
Yes, the danger, what she said, of being discovered. And it's strange because apparently as a child, you were at least aware of it. There also were people who simply didn't want to believe it. My dad himself had argued with a Jewish couple who were called up to register and they were going to go. And he said, don't go. They had a hiding place, a hiding address. And he talked them out of it, but they thought, well, what can they do? So they send us to the east. So not everybody was as aware, but my parents were. And as I said, at one point we had 2 Jewish couples staying with us. Our house was really not big enough for that, but it was very cramped. And that meant that you have to have extra food for everyone. Not just that you have to buy it, but you had to have ration cards, which was also one of the reasons that in the village, it was a little bit easier because where Maud lived, people, at least they raised some of their own food. But in town, you had to have extra ration stamps. And the underground did provide us those, but my mom had to buy bread at one baker and then she would send my older sister to a different baker because if every day she would buy bread for, say, 14 people instead of 7, that are, well, no, not quite. But anyway, you see the problem.
Right.
And so she was pretty careful. My sisters had to do quite a bit of the shopping. She had to insist that the people stay out of sight. They had to stay in the house. And one time the man who came to read the water meter suddenly said to her, Mrs. Canis, what happened? Your water use has doubled. Oh my gosh, water wasn't rationed, so she hadn't thought about that. And then she had to talk to our hiders and say, you can't leave the water run when you wash your hands or anything, you just use a little bit and you have to turn it off. And May got a little bit upset about that because they didn't, that was not the way they used to live, or the quality of food that went down, down and down. And that was the way it was for everyone. So it was very difficult. It was very cramped, but the couples had their own bedroom. And at some point, because my dad got more and more involved in the underground and also was involved in dangerous stuff, such as robbing a distribution center to get stamps, get food stamps, ration stamps, it was decided that these folks had to go somewhere else. And the one couple from Amersfoort went to neighbors of ours, and the other couple, and Maud knows them because the woman was her kindergarten teacher. And while Eva Schnell, and when she was staying at our house, she would tutor my little brother so he could go to 2nd grade as soon as he turned 6. So they had to go somewhere else. And they also went to the same village, to Olderbroek, different family, but also farmers. And I didn't even know that those two families are related. I didn't, I mean, I didn't know them personally, but they went, and when they were there, she will tell you, Maud saw her teacher again. That was the one couple that did not survive the war. The others did.
Maud, can you talk a little bit about that, about seeing your teacher
Well,
again and what
yeah.
happened?
I loved going to school. It was like in the next street from where we lived. And I loved my teacher, Mrs. Schnell. And of course, she was Jewish. She had escaped from Germany, had come to the Netherlands, as many German Jews did at that time. And she got a job teaching, and now she was fired because she was Jewish. And the family we lived with was very religious, and every Sunday we went to church. And I remember one Sunday we went to aunt, my new aunt, to her sister's farm, which wasn't that far away, because we had, they had bicycles, and we went over there, and we were so surprised because who was there but my kindergarten teacher and her husband were hiding there. So every Sunday after church, we would go over there, and she was beginning to teach us, because obviously my sister and I couldn't go to school during those years, and she was beginning to teach us how to read and write. And I think it must have been in 1944. I wrote a note. I didn't write it. Somebody wrote it. And I said, the teacher is giving me lessons. And that was in January of 1944. So must have been shortly thereafter where they were discovered and were taken, and both perished.
And that obviously, that's something that, so much connects the two of you, but something that so sadly does connect the two of you as well. So now as you're saying that, and please put questions in the chat. I see some coming through. I'm going to interject them. So please put questions in the chat if you have them. But so one thing that came up, Maud, about this as you were speaking is people are asking, so you were able to go out while you were in hiding. Why?
Well, not at first, because the very
Okay.
first evening we were there, they sat me down and told me why I was there, and it was not going to be a 2-week vacation. That and told me then that we were their nieces, that I now had a new name. My name in Dutch is Maud, pronounced Maud, and I was now Marie or Marie, and their last name Sprunk. My sister Rita became Rika. You can't go to school here because we're afraid you may say something to a classmate and we would be discovered. And they said, you have to remember this, and you have to call us aunt and uncle. My sister couldn't say tante, she called her Tunny. And they said, you have to stay in the house until you remember all that, because whoever will ask you, who are you? Because they spoke a dialect there. We were from the city. So, and we didn't have their clothes. We were still dressed in city clothes. I mean, it changed over the years, but so I had to stay in the house with my sister, not to answer any knocks on the door or anything, because German soldiers are walking all over. And until I now remembered who I am. And then I was allowed to go out with them to work the farms, go into the fields with them and that. So that was going out as much and going to church with them.
So you were able eventually to go out. And actually, that is the next question for both of you. Probably a little bit more. Ingrid was out and about a little more. Did you see the presence of the Nazi soldiers everywhere, even in the farmlands and the countryside? Were there Nazi presence all over Holland that you were able to see?
There were they were all over, but there were also Dutch Nazis, and so very soon people had a good feeling of who was okay and who was not okay. And you saw things very black and white, very black and white. And when I grew up, that was still the case. My dad knew from everyone in the city, if they had been a member, for instance, of the NSB, which was the Dutch Nazi party. And for instance, we would not buy at their stores, and we sort of wouldn't associate with them. He ranked people that way. That's part of how we grew up. And he himself, as I said, our family had just moved to town, so people didn't necessarily know what we were like or where our sympathies lay. But in 41, my one sister was born, the one that's 2 years older than I, and she was born on the Queen's birthday, on Queen Wilhelmina's birthday. She was named after the Queen, which was forbidden. You weren't allowed to wear orange. You weren't allowed to mention any living member of the royal family. And here were my parents, and they sent out birth announcements with an orange ribbon around it. And they had a thing in the newspaper even with her name, Wilhelmina. And so we got reactions from people we didn't know. We got orange flower arrangements, orange fruit baskets, orange cakes, and everybody celebrated my sister's birthday, which was, it was an interesting thing, but it also showed to the people in our town that we were okay. They knew then, because of that, what side we were on. And I think that's why my father got approached more often by people from the underground, because they knew where his sympathies lay. And sometimes people we didn't know at all. And they sort of feel you out. How do you feel about that? Do you know someone? Do you know a place? That's how things went.
Speaking of your parents, both sets of your parents, can you tell us what happened to each of your parents? Maud, we know you were separated from them. Can you tell us what happened to your parents? And then Ingrid, can you share with us? We know you were living with your parents and they were very much involved in the underground. What happened to them?
My parents had no place to go because obviously they were not going to the train station. Christian friends snuck in the house and said, "Where are the children?" And my parents explained that we had just gone into hiding that day. And they said, "Well, where are you going to go? We have no place." And they said, "Come stay with us." And they owned a car dealership at the edge of town. And they said, "Stay with us. The only problem is there's 2 German officers living in one of our bedrooms." But my parents had no place to go. So they packed a little bag with some things, left everything in the house, locked the door, and went to stay with their friends. And my parents lived in their attic for 3 years. My father could never go outside because he would be recognized. And second of all, he was of an age of young men who were just taken off the street by the German soldiers and shipped to work in factories in Germany. So he never went out. My mother dressed as a nurse and went out and tried to get food because 1944 to 1945 was the hunger winter in the Netherlands. There was no food. And so she would dress as a nurse and try to go out and find food for them and also for their friends who were hiding them. But they survived. They were never found, thank goodness.
Thankfully. And we're going to talk about that reunion in a minute, but I want to hear, Ingrid, about your parents and their involvement and what happened to them during the war.
Well, as I said, my dad was pretty active in the underground. And after they did an actual robbery of what we call a distribution center, he was arrested and imprisoned. And then he was sent to a concentration camp. My mother got a little notice saying that she could bring him, that he was in prison in Amsterdam. But of course, the prisons were totally full. So then he was, with other people, shipped to a concentration camp in Holland and then later to Dachau. And after about several months in Dachau, a whole contingent of Dutch prisoners was shipped to the Alsace in France. And when the Allied troops came, they were sent back to Dachau. And that is where he was ultimately liberated by the Americans. But he was almost dead. He was very, very sick. So my dad was, imprisoned. And my older sister, who had taken over a lot of his career work, she was 17 years old. She was picked up on the street and she was imprisoned. So here was my mom with little baby and a toddler and a young boy and another teenager. And we had animals. People couldn't keep their animals. So they, try and find a place for a dog or a cat. And she had to make it through the hunger winter she would get on her bicycle and she'd ride to the village where she was born. She knew a lot of farmers there. She would always insist that we didn't starve. No, we didn't. We didn't have much food, but we didn't starve. We did make it okay, but it was pretty awful because we spent a lot of time in the cellar because of the air raids that were going on. During that time, thousands of people in the big cities died from starvation. They look like, if you see the pictures, they look like indeed Holocaust victims. And that was very, very bad that last winter. That killed a lot of people. But my family did survive. They didn't know if my dad was still alive, but he was, and he did make it through.
Thankfully, he did, after the risk he put for everybody else and how he ended up in a camp himself. And that is, from everybody here, I thank you and your family for that, because that is truly remarkable. Another question that's coming through that's related to this is, were your parents politically involved before the Nazi invasion?
No, not really. But then the Dutch were sort of hoping to stay neutral. They stayed neutral during the First World War. It wasn't very realistic, but they hoped that, Germany wouldn't attack, and they did. And we did, we did hear what was happening in Germany. So they did have some idea of what was, with the Kristallnacht and all that kind of stuff. So right. They were very aware of what happened, but after the Germans invaded, then you had no longer had free press. You no longer could read a newspaper. You didn't know what was going on.
And so going on with that, Maud, what people are asking, what happened to Tani, who became your aunt? What happened to her after you left the farm, and were you ever reunited with her?
She continued to live on the farm. A nephew had come over when Uncle died to run the farm. His wife and baby came over to live on the farm also and take care of the farm. And after we were freed, which was, I just celebrated that this week, April 19, 1945, the Canadians freed us in the little village of Elber. And a couple of months later, we were told that they wanted us, the resistance or the underground wanted us to go back to the farm to stay with Aunt to see if my parents survived. And they did, as I said earlier. But I remember that day forever, because in the farm, there was a room, a door to the outside, a door into the farm, and there was a pump room because there was no running water. We had a water pump. And I remember a man and woman standing in the doorway, and we were with Tani hiding behind her skirts. We didn't know who these people were. And she gave me a shove and she said, "That's your mommy and your daddy. Shake their hand." I'm now 9.5 years old. I dutifully went over, shook their hand, and ran back because I didn't know who they were. I can imagine as a parent how my parents must have felt, thinking probably we would recognize them. They stayed on the farm for a couple of months, I guess. And so then I told them that one day that, okay, we'll go home with you. But if we don't like you, we're going to live with Tani, with Aunt. So we went home with my parents. And then, anytime like 5 years of a war, to try and go back to life as it was, it isn't. Everything was destroyed. Nobody had anything. We had no house. We moved into my Dutch grandparents' house. Our house was bombed, gone. And there was nothing in the house, no wood, because people during the war needed firewood. So houses that were abandoned, they took the firewood. The furniture was all gone because the Germans hired moving vans, and all the houses that they found where people had left, they took all the furniture and shipped it to Germany. So we had nothing.
And what happened to the rest of your family? You talked about your grandparents in the beginning. What happened to all of them?
My mother's parents, because my grandfather was the cantor in Frankfurt am Main in Germany, and they had also come to the Netherlands already in the 30s. So they were living with us, and also They were taken to Sobibor, where they perished. My Dutch grandfather also went to Sobibor. My mother was an only child. My father had a sister. She was married, and I had 3 little cousins. They were all taken to Sobibor. So my immediate little family, they were all gone. And of course, many of the other relatives. The only one who did not end up in a concentration camp was my Dutch grandmother. While they were in Amsterdam, because everybody had to go to Amsterdam first, she died there, and she is actually buried. I mean, amazingly enough, I found the obituary in a Dutch newspaper, with all this technology.
Technology now.
It's amazing. And she is buried in a Jewish cemetery near Amsterdam. A friend of mine has found her grave, and I have gone there, but she's the only one. But of course, so many cousins of my parents and everyone else, most of people perished, and mostly in Sobibor.
In Poland.
Yes.
So speaking of technology, can you both share with us how you've been in touch with each other and how that happened to be to have this beautiful friendship evolve and us be so fortunate to hear from you together?
Okay.
Ingrid started it.
I used to work on American Air Base in Holland. I met my husband there, so I came to the States. And when I lived in Texas, my parents, after I lived in, first we went to Texas, later we lived in Denver, and my parents came to visit us there. That's really when I became much more interested in what, the whole story, because my dad wanted to find the American soldiers who had liberated Dachau, and we did. It's a story in itself, so I'm not going to cover it. But that's when I did a lot of interviews with people, with ex-soldiers, and so when here I am living in Seattle now, and they had an Anne Frank exhibit here, and I volunteered to be a docent. So when I was doing that, I would tell a lot about Holland during the war, and then the people here said, "Oh, you have a story of your own, don't you?" I said, "Yeah." And so we started putting together my family's story. And I do have a list of names of all the people that my parents helped. And a lot of them I knew. Now, I didn't know Maud because she immigrated to the States, but I knew her name, and I knew that they lived in New Jersey, that her parents had moved to New Jersey, because I had a list again of our ex-hiders who gave my parents a trip to Israel when my dad turned 65 years old. And there was Maud's father's name was on there. And I thought, well, who knows, maybe she's still around. So I started Googling her, and at the center, I couldn't get a hold. I found your name. I found out a lot about you, but I couldn't get your address. And finally here at the center, they did find her address, and I emailed her and I said, you don't know me, but, and she said, "Oh, I remember very well." See, I thought she probably might not even know our name because everybody used false names.
Right.
And so, that nobody ever told her who we were. But but the most amazing thing was then that when I started doing the docenting part for the Holocaust Center, that I found out that she was doing that too, exact same thing. And so, why do we do this at this time of our life? It must be important.
Absolutely. And I'm going to ask you about that. Maud, just before we get into that, I want you to comment on what were your thoughts when Ingrid did reach out to you? And I know you've really devoted your life so much to this education. What were you thinking when she reached out to you? And did you ever think to find her or anybody else that had helped you?
I had tried, and I do remember going, with the Holocaust Commission, we used to go to Israel also, Yad Vashem. I discovered the righteous plaque to her family. And then I got a call from the Holocaust Commission saying this person was looking for you. And of course I knew the name. And I was thrilled. And so I think first I met one of your sisters on one of the trips, and then was telling about the trip, and I was just so delighted to meet someone. I mean, all those years earlier, I really wasn't doing that much on Holocaust because nobody really wanted to hear our stories for many, many years. It's just been, it's like even my parents, they didn't want to know anything of horrible things that happened to us or that we had seen. Well, it's over. Life has to go on. We're not going to talk about it. I didn't even know there was a concentration camp in my hometown until years later. Things like that, it was just never discussed. But I knew the name Canis very well. And so I was delighted to meet up with his daughters, 2 daughters I've met up with now.
And so both of you have devoted your lives. Maude, I just want to mention those that don't know, the trip that Maude is talking about is that the New Jersey State Commission on Holocaust Education every summer takes teachers led by Maude to Europe to see the infamous sites of the Holocaust, to go to Berlin and Prague, and then to Poland, and then ending in the Netherlands, seeing Amsterdam, and going to be able to go outside of Amsterdam and see where Maude was from and where she was hidden. So obviously you both, and Ingrid out in Seattle works at the Holocaust Center there. You both devoted so much of your life to teaching about this. Why? Why do you both feel it is so important to be able to do this now and to continue talking about it?
Well, I think it's very important. I do a lot of speaking to students. I don't really talk too much about I'm not being graphic of things that I've seen. And I talk about the war, and I really try to bring to people, first of all, not to forget what happened, but also respect, to really respect each other of who we are. It's to me, and I, talk about the Holocaust of what happened. And when I talk about bullying, I said, well, I remember those Hitler Youth. They were a bunch of bullies, and they were the ones who ended up in the army towards the end. So it's just respect and how we have to care for each other, especially in light today of what's happening in the Ukraine. I think it's so very, very important for students to learn what happened at the Holocaust, but to also walk away with something that I just read a card from a student, one of the schools, and he said, well, I listened to you, he said, and he said, after you spoke, I noticed 2 of my friends were picking on somebody. He said, I usually would have just walked away, but I decided, no, I'm going to say something. And it makes me feel so good when I read these things that kids have really taken it to heart. And really try to respect each other and help each other. Because if it wasn't for people who cared for my sister and I wouldn't be here today. And they cared, even risked their lives, even though they were Protestant, we were Jewish. They took us in and loved us for both families. And I think that's what I tried to bring, a message of hope and really caring and respecting.
And that is wonderful. And we thank you so much for doing that. Ingrid, can you share a little bit about your thoughts?
When I was growing up, everybody was sort of in the same position. They were rebuilding the country. I really didn't, spend that much time thinking about it until, as I said, until about 25 years after the war, when my dad told us more. I'm sure he had war stories, but it wasn't that important. But when you ask my parents what motivated them, I know especially my mother, she was daily in the middle of this, trying to keep the peace between the families, trying to see everybody was safe, was that this was so very wrong. This was such a big injustice that at some point you have to do something. And she also said that if you really did know beforehand what all it entailed, you probably wouldn't have the strength to do it, which is why it was maybe better that you didn't know everything that was going on. I also found, I've met a lot of people, there are a lot of there were survivors who simply, not only they wanted to get on with their life, but they simply could not retell those stories. It was too horrible. They had get nightmares. And so I think it is best if the people that are maybe a little bit removed, or the survivors that can, that they have to bear witness. And of course, the ones that were involved, if they can do it, that's great. But somebody has to tell the story, especially when you get people that say, oh, it didn't happen. So you have to speak out at that point.
Thank you both, and thank you both so much for all that you do to continue to tell these stories. I know personally, since I get the honor of being with you often on these speaks, that you do this endlessly and with such love and care. So I thank you for that. We have time for one more question, talking about the two of you and about Holland and going back there. Can you talk a little bit about what it is like? I know you've been there together, and what the community of Elberg and Amesfort, and what they are like today.
Well, I think everything, it's so many years later, everything has been rebuilt and people are going on with their lives. But in a little fishing village where we were hidden the last part of the war, there was a little synagogue. And they decided that it was being used for different things. I think it was shortly after I started doing the trips, they decided they were going to make it a little museum. And it is this little synagogue in this little, very medieval little village is a beautiful museum. It is only the second Holocaust museum in the Netherlands, and it was done by that village. It was so important to them. There was also a cemetery there that they have fixed up again. So there is a lot of today of people trying to remember, and this little museum is very dear to my heart. And Elise, you've been there. It's so important for all the wonderful things that people did and are still doing today. The Netherlands, I understand, is taking in many, many Ukrainians also. So again, it warms my heart to see of how much kindness is out there right now, especially for the Ukrainian people. And everyone is welcoming them and helping them. And I am so glad, because that's what we all should be doing, no matter who we are or what our religion is or what we look like, really care for each other.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that place is extremely special. I have been there and can say anybody that has the opportunity, it is somewhere special to see. Ingrid, is there anything you want to leave us with before we're done today?
Well, I think we pretty much covered it. And I find that when we tell our story, it's different when it's a person. It's a person, like a direct account, than reading a book. Of course, Anne Frank has sort of set this whole thing in motion, I think. But when I talk to students, they feel this is not just a story. This is real. This is what it was like. And one reaction that I treasured was I spoke to a junior high class. It was quite a large group. And then they all wrote a little note, thanking me and all that. And there was one that said, well, usually when we have a speaker like that, we sort of make fun of people. But nobody did when you talked. And I thought, okay, they did catch the seriousness that is behind all this. Yes, it's not a joke. It was an awful, awful time.
What I do want to say is, though, that Hitler did not succeed with my family. Our family tree, many branches were cut off and broken. But today, that tree is growing with many branches. We have 4 children, 9 grandchildren, and I now have a great granddaughter. So
Which is incredible. We are so happy to hear that. And thankfully, both your families survived and thrived and were able to truly rebuild and go on to teach the world and tell the world how important it is to remember. And we can't thank you enough for being here on this very important day on Yom HaShoah, as we remember the 6 million Jews and 6 million others that died senselessly at the hands of the Nazis, that were murdered. And think about all those that did help, all those saviors and those that did survive to go on, like you and your families, to rebuild their lives. And we hope and pray that there are many more people like you out there in the world today from hearing your story. So thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us today. Please always reach out to us at the Holocaust Council at Federation, as well as to the Holocaust Resource Center at Kane University. It's a privilege to be here with you. Good night.
Thank you so much. Good night.
Thank you.